Welcome to the Cale Clark Show and welcome to Holy Week. I'm here with producer Lucas Holt. And Lucas, I hope you're having a great week so far. We are going to talk about the most sacred season in the church's calendar year. It's only 3 days, but man, these are the 3 days that changed all of human history. Talking about the sacred Triduum, which is kind of a season within a season. It's beginning with the Mass of the Lord's Supper on Holy Thursday and extends all the way through Good Friday, Holy Saturday, the silence of Holy Saturday, no liturgical action on that day, and of course the Easter Vigil, technically beginning on the Saturday evening, but of course, as the Jews reckon time, the Vigil counts for the next day because sundown really marks the end of one day and the beginning of another. So anyways, let's get into it. Before we do that, it's a good thing I didn't give up Diet Coke for Lent. I'm going to crack open another one. Oh yeah, as we crack open another show. So Lucas wanted to do something a little bit different for today's show. I really want to focus specifically on Holy Thursday, the secrets of the Last Supper, because there's a lot going on here, of course, when we look at the readings. And on Holy Thursday, the gospel reading comes to us from the Gospel of John, chapter 13. Now, it's interesting because, as you know, Lucas, in John's gospel, there is no institution of the Eucharist per se. When Jesus gives the words of institution, this is my body, this is my blood. But instead, John offers us another scene, which is the footwashing episode at the Last Supper. So I'm just going to read the text from the gospel from John chapter 13, then we can talk about it a little bit. It says, before the feast of Passover, Jesus knew that his hour had come to pass from this world to the Father. He loved his own in the world, and he loved them to the end. The devil had already induced Judas, son of Simon the Iscariot, to hand him over. So during supper, fully aware that the Father had put everything into his power and that he had come from God and was returning to God, he rose from supper and took off his outer garments. He took a towel and tied it around his waist. Then he poured water into a basin and began to wash the disciples' feet and dry them with the towel around his waist. He came to Simon Peter, who said to him, Master, are you going to wash my feet? Jesus answered and said to him, what I am doing you do not understand now, but you will understand later. Peter said to him, you will never wash my feet. Jesus answered him, unless I wash you, you will have no inheritance with me. Simon Peter said to him, Master, then not only my feet, but my hands and head as well. Jesus said to him, whoever has bathed has no need except to have his feet washed, for he is clean all over. So you are clean, but not all. For he knew who would betray him. For this reason, he said, not all of you are clean. So when he had washed their feet and put his garments back on and reclined at table again, he said to them, do you realize what I have done for you? You call me teacher and master, and rightly so, for indeed I am. If I, therefore, the master and teacher, have washed your feet, you ought to wash one another's feet. I have given you a model to follow, so that as I have done for you, you should also do. Okay, so that's the gospel there. And of course, it's always hilarious to listen to Peter. He's always telling Jesus what to do. You will never wash my feet. You can't go to the cross. Get behind me, Satan. Okay, if you're not going to wash my feet, you're not going to let me do this to you, Peter, then you have no part with me. Which is kind of interesting because Jesus does talk like that a little bit in John's gospel. If certain things aren't done, there are dire consequences. If you don't eat my flesh and drink my blood, this is, of course, John chapter 6, when he's talking about the Eucharist, which is instituted, of course, at the Last Supper, the first Mass. If you don't eat my flesh and drink my blood, you have no life within you. And now he says to Peter, if you don't let me wash you, then you have no part with me. So it's the same kind of language. So then Peter says, okay, well, forget just the foot washing. Let's just hose down my entire body. I'm all in. So it's the impetuousness of Peter, the daring of Peter, but also, of course, the um, misunderstandings of Peter as well, for sure. Lucas, an interesting question here is, why is it that John in his gospel does not have an institution narrative, if you will? This is my body, this is my blood. I think part of the reason is he may already be aware of the other gospels covering this ground. Most scholars think that John wrote after the synoptic gospels. I mean, you might find a few outliers who say maybe he wrote earlier, but it's quite possible that John already knows about Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And by the way, the word synoptic means seeing as if through one eye. If you read Matthew, Mark, and Luke, you see that they cover a lot of the same stuff. And I do believe they are literarily dependent on one another to a certain extent. The majority view, although there are some who differ, think that both Matthew and Luke used Mark as a source when they were writing their own gospels, which kind of makes sense. If it's Peter's gospel, really, most tradition holds that Peter is the source behind Mark's knowledge, and it's really the preaching of Peter in many ways, the reminiscences of Peter that are underlying Mark's gospel. Of course, the Prince of the Apostles, you're going to defer to him on most things anyways. But it's likely that Mark wrote first. Matthew and Luke used Mark as a source, although Matthew and Luke are writing independently of one another. Matthew's not using stuff from Luke, Luke's not using stuff from Matthew, but they're both using stuff from Mark, if that makes any sense. But it's quite possible that John is already aware of the institution narrative being in there. It's, of course, also covered in St. Paul's first letter to the Corinthians. He mentions the institution narrative there as well. So he talks about instead the foot washing scene. Now, I don't know if you ever heard, Lucas, Holy Thursday is sometimes called by some Christian groups Maundy Thursday. Have you ever heard this before? And I don't know if you know what this means, but a lot of people are confused by this. What does this mean? You might see non-Catholic Christian groups talking about a Maundy Thursday service, as opposed to the Mass of the Lord's Supper. But even in Catholic circles, sometimes it is referred to as Maundy Thursday. Well, what does that mean? Maundy essentially means commandment. And this is, of course, also when you look at John's Gospel, that same chapter 13 where the foot washing scene takes place at the Last Supper. John 13 also gives us this new commandment, the novum mandatum in Latin. And what is the new commandment? To love one another as I have loved you. That's John 13:34. So this is all in context of the foot washing. And Jesus, of course, lives his own teaching to the max. And Jesus says in the very next verse, John 13:35, by this, if you love one another, by this, all people will know that you are my disciples, if you have love for one another. So this is the humble service and love that Christ is about to demonstrate for his apostles, for his disciples at the Last Supper, by taking on this role that was in his culture in that time reserved for the lowest of servants, the washing of the feet. Because whenever a big dinner was held in someone's home, you're walking the dusty roads, people are wearing sandals. You know, if you watch The Chosen or any other depiction of Jesus' life, this is what's going on. So when you come into a house, your feet are usually pretty caked up with mud, dirt, the road, all that stuff. So a servant would bathe the feet of the guests, wash the feet of the guests. It's considered just a normal act of courtesy. So Jesus is about to actually perform this very menial task for the lowest of servants. The Lord of the universe washes his disciples' feet. And this is why Peter doesn't want this to happen. He finds this humiliating. This seems wrong to him. And when I think about this great act of love and service that Jesus performs, Lucas, for his friends, it kind of reminds me that, at Easter time, and we're going to talk about this stuff too, especially next week as we get into the Easter season, Lucas, we're big into apologetics here. We're big into explaining and defending the faith. And this is a really good time to do that the crucifixion actually happened in human history, that the resurrection was a real historical event. And if it didn't happen, our preaching is useless, and so is our faith, as St. Paul says in 1 Corinthians chapter 15. So we focus a lot during this time of trying to convince people in their minds using reason, using logic, using history. But when we think about the evangelistic mission, of course, a great analogy is fishing. Jesus called fishermen, and he said, from now on, you will become fishers of men. And when you catch a fish, of course, Lucas, you catch the fish by the head. You throw out a lure, you throw out a hook, and you hope it bites on. And that's mostly what we try to do in our apostolic endeavors, in our evangelistic endeavors. We were trying to use apologetics, faith, reason, history to catch, at least I do, to catch people by the head with the mind. But we also have to catch people by the heart too. And some people, some quote unquote fish that we're trying to catch, they can only be caught by the heart. They are more moved by seeing an act of selfless service or the love that believers show for one another. As Jesus said, by this all men will know, all women will know as well, that you are my disciples because you love one another. So I just think it's kind of interesting as we get into Holy Week, we get into the Triduum, to think about that as well. Don't just think about catching fish by the head, also think about catching them by the heart. All right, so let's get into some of the secrets of the Last Supper. I do want to talk about, now I'm going to take a bit of a different tack here. One of the things that we do on Holy Thursday is we don't just celebrate the institution of the Eucharist. Do this in memory of me. We're going to talk about what those words actually mean in an interesting way in just a moment. And that's, of course, the institution of the Eucharist. But also on this night, on Holy Thursday, at the Last Supper, which was really the first Mass, Jesus is also instituting the sacramental priesthood, holy orders, the sacrament of holy orders. And I want to talk about what the foot washing has to do with this. I think John is actually tipping us off, if we're really avid Bible readers, by using the foot washing scene to tell us something about Jesus instituting the priesthood. It's really intriguing. Now, I remember reading once that the Council of Trent, this is intriguing. Back to the Synoptic Gospels, do this in remembrance of me. The Council of Trent taught, and I believe it was, if memory serves, it was in canon number 2. If anybody does not believe that when Jesus said, do this in remembrance of me, that he's not instituting the priesthood when he's commanding the apostles to do this, do what? Celebrate the Eucharist, celebrate the Mass. If anyone doesn't believe that he's instituting the priesthood, let that person be anathema. Let that person be cursed. That's very, very strong language. Okay, all right, okay, we got that. But what's interesting too is when you look at those words, in remembrance of me, we read this in the English translation of our Gospels, but the actual word that's used in Greek is anamnesis, for remembrance. Do this in anamnesis of me. Now, when you hear that word anamnesis, it kind of sounds a little bit like amnesia, doesn't it? Anamnesis. Okay, amnesia. Okay, well, amnesia has to do with forgetting, but anamnesis has to do with remembering, but much more than remembering. This is actually way stronger. It actually means to make present, to make something present. Those saving events are made present to us. We are made, maybe it's a better way to say it, we are made present to those saving events. And really, every time we go to Mass, it's supernatural time travel. We are not ripped off because we didn't get to walk the dusty streets of Galilee, the dusty roads with Jesus and his apostles. We were not in that upper room where Jesus is celebrating the Passover and transforming it into the Eucharist, because we are made present to those saving events every time we go to Mass. The bonds of time and space are broken, and we're not being ripped off. We actually are there mystically. And so Christ is not being sacrificed again and again and again at every Mass, as some non-Catholic caricatures like to put it. This is the once for all sacrifice, the perfect sacrifice, and we are being made present to it. And to help us understand how this anamnesis, making present, kind of works, we sort of have to look at the tradition of the rabbis, because when the rabbis were instructing people on how they should celebrate the Passover in their homes, we know that they did. They had something called the Passover Haggadah, which is word Haggadah essentially means the Passover liturgy, as it were. One of the things that the rabbis taught was this, that when you're celebrating this, it is as if you yourselves were walking dry shod on the floor of the Red Sea, with the waters parted around you, just as the Israelites during their Exodus, they walked through the Red Sea as if on dry ground. That this is exactly what's happening to you. It is as if you yourselves are walking dry shod at the bottom of the Red Sea, crossing over to safety, to salvation. Because, of course, remember, Pharaoh is essentially a type of Satan, oppressing the people of God. The Egyptian army are almost like demons chasing you down. So when you get through there, you're crossed over on the other side to safety, to salvation. And so just as every Jew sort of, in a way, were mystically present at those saving events of the Exodus, the same is kind of happening to us, but on a much more real level with the Eucharist, the reality of the body, blood, soul, and divinity of Jesus Christ. So when we hear that old hymn, were you there? Were you there when they crucified my Lord? Not to pull a little karaoke Cale on you there, but we can actually say, yeah, we were there. We are there every time we participate in the celebration of the Mass. So this is something really important. This word remembrance doesn't mean simply to recall. It means to make present, and that's really important.
I know
So
it's been a while
sorry
since
about the singing,
karaoke Cale has
Lucas.
come out, so exactly, yeah. So
Yeah, got to let
I'm
him out of the
curious
box
about
once in a
this
while.
connection between the institution of the priesthood and the washing of the feet, um, because that is a
Mm,
connection that I don't think
yeah,
most people are probably familiar with. Um, I think we often hear the homilies on this is about humble service, and we need to imitate this and serve other people, which is true and
right.
good. But there are other things
Yep,
that
that's
are being
absolutely
shown
true.
here. Um, so, yeah.
Yeah, yeah, I want to get into that because most people don't know anything about this. And I remember reading a blog post by this guy Jacob Michael years ago. He wrote a blog called the Lumen Gentleman blog, which I thought was a really cool name. Obviously, playing off Lumen Gentium, one of the documents of Vatican II, the one on the church. Lumen Gentleman. I thought that was a great name. I don't know if he copyrighted that, but he should. And he talked about this, and it kind of blew my mind because I hadn't heard about this before. And I want to get into some of the background of this. There's actually a lot to it, but I'll try to summarize quickly. All right. If you know your Old Testament really, really well, Lucas, you might remember this incident from Leviticus chapter 16. Now, I know you probably have Leviticus chapter 16 memorized, right? You probably wake up every morning doing your devotions, praying with your cup of coffee in Leviticus 16. I know you're just saturated in that text. No, I mean, it is part of the Word of God. We do need to pay attention to these Old Testament books, but it's one of the books that we don't tend to spend a whole lot of time in. We don't meditate a lot on the dietary laws of Leviticus, but chapter 16 of Leviticus has to do with the Day of Atonement, Yom Kippur, if you will. What does that mean, by the way? The word atonement. Now, this is kind of cheesy preaching, but I've heard preachers say if you actually split up that word atonement, you get at one meant. At one meant. ONE. So we need to become one with our Lord. We need to become reunited with our Lord. Atonement, at one meant. Okay, as cheesy as that might be, there is a lot of theological truth there. Well, in Leviticus chapter 16, it talks about what the great high priest is supposed to do to help facilitate that. Now, I just want to pick up the text. I'm not going to read the whole thing, but let's start at verse 23 of Leviticus chapter 16. Check this out. It says, then Aaron, and who's Aaron? He's the high priest. He's the first high priest, if you will, the brother of Moses. The rod of Aaron, of course, was one of the items that was in the Ark of the Covenant, the priestly staff of Aaron. So it says, then Aaron shall come into the tent of meeting and shall put off the linen garments which he put on when he went into the holy place. It's kind of interesting. So he puts on these linen garments and then he takes them off. What does he do next? He shall put off the linen garments which he put on when he went into the holy place and shall leave them there. And he shall bathe his body, verse 24, he shall bathe his body in water in a holy place and put on his garments, and then come forth and offer his burnt offering and the burnt offering of the people, and make atonement for himself and for the people. That's Leviticus 16, verses 23 and 24. That is fascinating when you think about this. Aaron, the great high priest, does what? Takes off his outer garments, linen garments, bathes himself, then he puts them back on, and then he goes out and offers an atoning sacrifice. So what does Jesus do in John chapter 13? Holy Thursday. He takes off his garment, his outer garment, lays it aside, wraps himself, of course, in a towel, the towel of a servant, as it were, and then he washes, not himself, but the feet of his apostles. Now, what does this exactly have to do with the sacrifice of Aaron in Leviticus 16? Well, again, back to the rabbis here. As the tradition went on, the interpretive tradition in Israel, the rabbis taught, when they interpreted Leviticus 16, they taught this, that after this event, this first thing that Aaron did, after this event, it was no longer necessary for the high priest to bathe himself completely, as Aaron did before he puts on his garments again, then offers the sacrifice. After Aaron does it the first time, all that's necessary from that point on is for the high priest to wash his hands and what else? His feet. And then he could offer the sacrifice for the people. Now, I think that Jesus actually agreed with this interpretation, because what does he do? As he's instituting the new covenant priesthood as our great high priest, he doesn't wash himself as Aaron did, because he doesn't need to. He doesn't wash himself. He doesn't wash his own feet. He washes the feet of his apostles, and then he puts his garment back on, and then he goes out to offer the perfect atoning sacrifice on the cross. Now, of course, it doesn't happen right away. That's when the passion begins. But you get it. And the parallels to me are just unmistakable.
That is fascinating. And yeah, because it's taking place within the context of the Passover. It's taking place within the context of the Last Supper. And so even though John isn't giving us a direct institution narrative like we see in the Synoptic Gospels, nevertheless, this is happening within the Last Supper. And so the connection between the Eucharist and the cleansing of the feet and the command to do this in remembrance of me, and then that kind of carrying forward into his passion, and then obviously resurrection. I mean, it's that's pretty interesting. I never would have made that connection with Leviticus 16. I'm gonna have to go back and find it.
Yeah. It's an absolutely amazing connection. And the other thing too that's interesting that we don't really have time to get into right now, but when you read the Song of Solomon, when you read a lot of biblical books of the Old Testament, a euphemism for the marital embrace is, you got to wash your feet. And this is interesting. When David is trying to cover up his adultery with Bathsheba, he tries to make it look like Uriah is really the husband of Bathsheba, one of David's top generals. He tries to make it look like he's really the father of this child that's going to result from this union. So he says to Uriah, why don't you go home, wash your feet, and hang out with your wife for a little bit? Essentially, a little bit of a paraphrase there, but the washing of the feet is a euphemism for the marital embrace. And this is in the Song of Solomon as well. This language is used. So that's also kind of interesting because Jesus is the divine bridegroom and the church is his bride. And when is he going to essentially give rise to this marital relationship, as it were? Well, on the cross, of course, we see blood and water coming out of the side of Christ. As the soldier's lance pierces his heart, blood and water come out, and that's an actual physical condition that takes place. This is not literary license necessarily by John when he talks about this in his Passion narrative, which we will look at on Good Friday. It's always the Passion narrative from John. There's when the human heart is under tremendous stress, as Jesus's was from the events of the Passion, a sort of sac of water can form around the heart, and this would have been what's called a pericardial efflusion of water. The sac is pierced, and a fluid that looks like water comes out, also with a lot of blood. But of course, John sees this, and the church has always seen this as having a much deeper meaning of symbolizing the Eucharist, the sacraments of Eucharist and baptism that flow forth from his heart. In essence, the church being born from the side of Christ, just as Eve, the wife of Adam, was brought forth from the side of Adam while he was asleep. And Jesus is in the sleep of death on the cross as the church, his bride, is then brought forth, if you will. So, and of course, the Eucharist itself is called, if you look at Ecclesia de Eucharistia, the last great encyclical of St. John Paul the Great, Pope John Paul II, he talks about the Eucharist as being the sacrament of the bridegroom and the bride, because we collectively are the church. We're united to the bridegroom in the Eucharist. My friend Cardinal Collins likes to say that, and in this season, of course, after Easter, we're going to see a lot of First Communions happening in our local parishes. And Cardinal Collins always says, we don't tell the little boys and girls when they're dressed up in their finest. The little boys are wearing their nice little suits, and the girls are wearing these beautiful white dresses and veils. It's kind of a bridal image in a sense. We don't tell them that this is really a dress rehearsal for death, because what's happening when we die, that's our definitive union with Jesus Christ. And so we can't get any closer to God without dying when we receive his body, blood, soul, and divinity at every Mass. So there's just a lot of implications here. And I think that all of these things are some of the
It's
secrets,
interesting too. I'm
Lucas,
just kind of
of
thinking
the
about,
Last Supper.
when Jesus says to Peter, unless I do this, you will have no part in me. I always used to interpret that kind of as like, I guess I don't really know what I used to think of that, but when I think, within the context of knowing the institution of the priesthood, it's almost like, unless you are ordained, as it were, under the authority of Christ, then you do not have a sharing in the true priesthood. And it's like, there's a lot of, and of course, as Catholics, we believe and teach that the priesthood is the true succession that goes all the way back to the very beginning. Um, with the, yeah, with Christ as the
Yeah.
authority, and
Apostolic
that's what
succession,
gives it
yes.
its validity. Um, and so there are a lot of other kind of quote unquote priests out there, but have they really, can they,
Mm-hmm.
is it because of Christ's own doing, or is it because of the doing of man, or their own doing? Um, so anyways, I'm just kind of thinking out loud, but I thought maybe,
Mm.
that's that you would have no part in me unless he washes his feet. Um, within the context of the priesthood makes sense.
It does. And let me just quickly look up a couple of other examples of this change of status. And that's really what's going on here. It's a change of status for Peter and the other disciples here. Well, this guy this guy Jacob Michael alluded to the scholar Jerome Nere, a Jesuit scholar, who talked about how the foot washing was a status transformation ritual. And this goes back to these words. If you don't let me do this, then you have no part with me. And this if then motif is present elsewhere in the Gospel of John. Way back in John chapter 3, of course, Jesus has this dialogue with Nicodemus. He talks about baptism. He talks about the necessity of being born again or born from above through baptism. Unless a man is born again of water and the Spirit, he cannot enter heaven. So the baptism changes your status from outsider to insider. And then, of course, John chapter 6, we talked about this earlier. Unless a person eats of the flesh of Christ and drinks his blood, he has or she has no life. And so the change of status, once again, the person who had no life before now has life. And then you look at John chapter 8, verse 24. You will die in your sins, Jesus says, unless you believe that I am he. So unless you do this, you don't get that. John chapter 15, verse 4, the branch cannot bear fruit by itself unless it abides in the vine. Neither can you unless you abide in me. So, unless or except you do this, you can't have that. So this is what's called, according to Jerome Neri, a status transformation. Okay, that's what it's all about, a ritual that's going to find you in a certain place, but take you to a different status, if you will. And so that's really what is also lying in the background here of the foot washing and the conferring of the priesthood on the apostles. All right. Okay, so hopefully that was all clear as mud, at least, and might give you a few different things to think about as you go to Holy Thursday Mass, the Mass of the Lord's Supper. Hey guys, want to remind you, you can sign up for our Jubilee pilgrimage to Rome, Lourdes, and Fatima. It's 3 pilgrimages for the price of 1. It's going to be an incredible time. November 3rd to the 12th, and you can go to my website, go to caleclark.com, C-A-L-E, Clark with an E.com. Sign up for my email list, and I'll make sure that you get information about how to sign up. Or you can simply go to Canterbury Pilgrimages. Those are the fine folks that we're working with on this trip. This wonderful pilgrimage, canterburypilgrimages.com/Cale. We'll put a link to it in the show notes. If you're watching on YouTube, if you're listening on Apple Podcasts or on Spotify, we're so grateful that you're with us. Won't you share this show with a friend? We want to grow the community, want to grow the family of listeners that we have here for the program.
Happy Easter, happy Resurrection Day, and looking forward to the future episodes that we do on the resurrection.
Amen. Yeah, we've got a lot of stuff planned for you. The incredible facts about Easter and the reality of it that you can share with friends. And we will get into some of that apologetics in the next few episodes, but really make the best of Holy Week. Even if so far Lent, maybe some of the resolutions you made for Lent haven't worked out, there's still time. And let's go like the thief on the cross at the 11th hour. Say, Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom. It's never too late. Let's live this Triduum, this sacred Triduum, very, very well. And a happy Easter to all of you from me too. God bless. And we'll catch you in the next one.